Joining me now, Greg Sheridan, foreign editor at The Australian. Greg, look, we always talk about first world problems because we're in a first world country. So to a degree, that's fair enough. But it's hard to ignore, isn't it, COVID ripping through Africa and Asia in particular. And I saw as well, a lot of the poorer nations won't get much access to the vaccine until 2023.
Yeah, that's right, Tom. So the virus is actually more numerous now than it ever has been. The virus is still doing pretty well in its competition with humanity. Indonesia is in a terrible crisis. So is Malaysia. India seems to be over the worst of its crisis, but still there's an enormous load of disease there. But there is a largely unremarked in Australia massive crisis ripping through Africa. Some nations there have been in denial, like Tanzania, but hospitals all over these regions are running out of oxygen. People are dying routinely. The caseload is much underestimated because millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people, are dying in villages and not being recorded as COVID deaths. But Tom, even in the developed world, as you were reporting recently, Israel is putting restrictions back on. This virus is not finished with us yet. It hasn't finished with all its tricks. And this Delta variant is causing massive trouble all over the world in developed and developing countries. And we don't know that it's the worst and the last of the variants.
It's interesting that, isn't it? I'm going to start with the glass half full on that. That a lot of the time what happens with viruses, and yes, COVID, I should say, you know, it's a 1 in 100 year one, but they eventually can become less dangerous but more contagious, and that would be the, you know, the amazing news we just hope and pray for. That's the Hail Mary, I guess, for a lot of these countries we're talking about in such dire situations without much access to vaccine. That would be the best hope right now.
Well, that's true, Tom, but there's not actually much indication of that happening. So the evolutionary theory is that it's good for the virus not to kill off all its hosts too quickly, so just to make you sick for a long time rather than to kill you, so that it's got lots of warm bodies to live in and pass around in. There's a lot of debate really about whether this Delta virus is more severe. It's certainly more transmissible. A couple of weeks ago, British authorities were saying it's definitely more severe. Now they're saying maybe not, the death rate is a bit lower than it was with the Alpha strain. But that's largely because most of the people in Britain have already been vaccinated, especially the vulnerable people. We also don't know what its long-term consequences are in terms of long COVID. There are apparently 2 million Brits and millions of Americans with long COVID. And for many of these people, this is a very serious illness and condition. Now, at no point along the track of this virus, I've been interviewing epidemiologists all the way through, and at no point have the epidemiologists been able to predict accurately what the virus is going to do next. That's not because they're incompetent epidemiologists, it's just the virus hasn't read the same textbooks as them. So there's no guarantee that it won't come up with a more lethal variant, which also gets through vaccines. I mean, Delta does get through immunity a bit more effectively than Alpha did, which did it a bit more effectively than the Wuhan virus did. So, yeah, hopefully vaccines change everything, and probably they do. Hopefully the mutation becomes benign, but there's no real sign of that yet.
No, and there's no sign that will happen, and there's no guarantee. And look, I guess every now and then I like to pretend the glass is half full, Greg. But let me ask you this, because you mentioned the variants, and there's no way we know which way they'll go. Does that surprise you that there is such delayed access? And I know we've got the COVAX facility that's meant to share them out, but it's a very low rate to these developing countries, because that's where mutations happen really quickly. A lot of people mixing with the virus, and it actually is in our interest to make sure that there's a bit more vaccine to go around. But so far, everyone's sort of in it for themselves. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, but when will that focus switch, do you think? Only once wealthier nations are vaccinated?
Well, Tom, I think you're absolutely right, but it is in human nature that people look after their family first. It's a bit like when you get the oxygen mask in an aeroplane, you know, strap it onto yourself first, and then you're able to look after the kid that's travelling with you. It's very bad that Australia has been so slow in getting the vaccines. A lot of reasons for that, but nonetheless it's bad. It's just really a question of production capacity. A lot of countries made bad mistakes. I mean, India didn't maximise the number of vaccines it could manufacture, even though it has a big manufacturing capability. Naturally, countries supplied themselves first. I think now all around the world we're ramping up the production of vaccines and we're going to get there eventually. For Australia, we've just kind of got to sort of hold our nerve until we get everyone vaccinated. There are some countries in the developing world which are anti-vaccine, which is really crackers. The country I mentioned a minute ago, Tanzania, was one. And there are a lot of people, you know, leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who have been very ambivalent about vaccines. So is Vladimir Putin in Russia. As a result, Russia has a very low vaccine rate and a very high disease rate. But, Tom, we don't yet know that vaccines fix everything. We certainly hope they do. We don't yet know they do. I was interested until a minute ago, Gladys Berejiklian was saying we're going to need 80% vaccination rate before we could move to any new stage. Today she's threatening to abandon lockdowns altogether.
Yeah.
I mean, and she's a sober, steady, good politician, but this virus makes fools of everybody.